Yes, my main question is how your argument relates to democracy rather than to war. Because in the beginning I thought you will examine some endemic relationship between democracy and lying. But then you move to war in the sense that war can affect any type of political regime, yes, especially through the increase of executive power. Even Madison said that once the executive makes war, it benefits by itself, by its secrecy. So the question is, if one distinguishes between democracy and war, what is the, let's say, affinity between democracy and lying?
Between democracy and lying?
Democracy and lying. If we suspend the case of war and foreign policy.
Oh, if you suspend that case?
Yes.
I do try to talk about other areas of policy and other aspects of life, including advertising. I take very seriously the Frankfurt School critique, which is that the more enlightenment seems to exist, the more other things in fact exist, like semi-enlightenment and pseudo-enlightenment. I try to distinguish between these two things. I think that the larger the audience for anything, leaving sports aside, the more simple, the more coarse, the more reduced the thing is, and that goes for domestic policy and all politics. There are many sources in a democracy that spread untruth, even leaving aside foreign policy. One of the greatest is the bias of partisanship. The other is the success of appeals that appeal not to the best in people, but to something less than the best. Another is the need to speak simply, crudely, in order to be understood. These all have to do with intrinsic features of democracy, and they will guarantee, if it is a mass democracy with mass media of communication, and a sense that we are free to think and free to speak, it will guarantee that many things in life will sink rather than rise.
Because are you implying that democracy is the regime of truthfulness?
No. It is in one case, New England town meeting and things like it, where people knew each other, they knew the ins and outs of all the policies, there were no secrets, no terrible complexities, no force and violence, no sense of patriotism to muddy the waters. It was the formal politics of neighborliness. If you can't have that, you don't have democracy. You have something else, let's call it democracy, and it's better in some respects than other things, but Churchill's dictum remains right. It's the worst of all possible forms of government except for all the others. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to not be able to give you a better answer. I hope I'm not being victimized by a mood that might pass, but I may be.
Hi, I was just wondering about your earlier critique of the foreign policymakers that don't know the consequences of their policies, yes, and if that goes against Arendt's concept of action, and that action necessarily doesn't have an end and no one can know its consequences.
Yes.
And
it does. It does. Arendt gives a marvelous, an exhilarating account of the possibilities of free action, unpredictable, ungovernable, and creating a world, making the world different from what it had been before the course of action was undertaken. I want to say yes, that is something to think about. It is exhilarating. However, when it involves violence, and Arendt's conception of politics is non-violent, everything changes, and everything with a plus sign becomes now a minus sign. though Arendt never wrote in praise of Gandhi, she certainly deplored violence, and the book on violence is in effect saying, anytime you associate violence with anything, you ruin that thing. So even if you were to take Arendt here as an apostle of unpredictability, you first have to say this is a non-violent idealization. Now, does that lead you to a follow-up thought?
Only in the human condition, I think Arendt also says that every war is necessarily fought for the sake of peace. And does that sort of complicate the notion of war and violence?
That's what St. Augustine says. And she never wanted to call Augustine a liar. But Augustine knew better, as he describes the love of cruelty, the love of power for its own sake in Rome. Augustine was not of two minds on this, and she didn't want it. She liked war a bit too much, actually. You know her preface to J. Glenn Gray's The Warriors. She says, war is not in itself bad, and yet in other respects, she said, never use violence. Never use violence. She warned the students, don't turn violent in the 60s and 70s. With a third hand, she defended violent insurgencies. So she's not of one mind either. Do I believe firmly in the principle of nonviolence? Yes, in every instance except self-defense, but the self-defense must be literally self-defense and not some abstract conception of what is having a self and being defended. That's where that's where metaphor is mischief, when it takes us in.
However, your description of the evil of politics was so beautiful that almost was sublime. So, anyway, my question is the following. I am less inclined than you to think that in a direct democracy we are more sincere. Perhaps we are more frightening to be sincere before the others, and we try to conceal our true beliefs or ideas. And in some sense, the distance, an interesting proof of how healthy a democracy is. I want to have a kind of life distance between you and me, not to be forced to show myself. This question of distance, though, should be reversal in relation to the elite. And so this question to you is related to contemporary politics. Our leaders, well, no matter whether in a stupid country like mine, Italy, or this, our leaders, they really think that they are like all the other citizens and they can claim the same kind of rights to privacy or to concealment. We can do so in the name of that distance that I mentioned to you. I think that it is relevant to recognize the different in duty responsibility and thus also freedom that the leaders should have. They cannot have the same freedom we do have in claiming concealment for what they do.
Yes.
And the other question, would you agree that in some situations, for very powerful people in the elite, we should think at new forms of ostracism? Meaning ostracism from the political, for the complete political participation in politics. For instance, not to be elected, not to have the right to be elected. So there are limits to which we can recognize, that our democracy should deal with.
Right. Well, for ostracism to work, you would need